Hello, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you the second of the series of three 50mm reviews in this series of a 50mm Sony FE comparison. And so in today's episode, we're going to look at the smallest but medium-priced option of the three lenses, and that is the Sony Zeiss Sonnar. This is a 55mm f1.8, and while it's, of course, technically not a 50mm lens at 55mm, it is, within that ballpark, and it's certainly an alternative that a lot of people will consider for a number of reasons. And we're going to explore those here today. So the first thing I'm going to do is to recap a few of the design elements here, things that I want to point to. And so if you would like a more kind of detailed breakdown of the build, design, and handling of the lens, I would recommend that you look at this episode here. Now this, of course, as noted, is the smallest of the three lenses, and as you can tell here, it is a very compact lens. It's impressively small and nicely light, and so it weighs in at only 9.91 ounces or 281 grams, and it's under 3 inches in length, 2.78 inches or 70.5 millimeters long. And so it's an extremely compact lens, and as a result, this is really probably the best lens of the bunch by a fairly good margin if you're considering getting one for APS-C. And I have tested it a fair bit on a Sony a6500, and it's small and compact enough that it really looks and feels like it belongs there. And that's not to take away from its full frame performance like on this A7R Mark III. It does well there, but it's also a very natural fit for APS-C. And so if you're someone who is considering looking at a lens to shoot kind of on dual systems, maybe full frame and APS-C, this is in many ways going to be the most attractive option, in a lot of ways just because of the size and the balance of the lens itself. I'll also note that the 55mm focal length, when you look at it with the 1.5 times crop factor of a Sony APS-C sensor, it is, I think, in a lot of ways the most natural focal length of the three options. 50mm, of course, with a 1.5 times crop factor, it puts you into a 75mm equivalent range, which is somewhat in no man's land. It's not quite to a fully effective portrait length, and of course it's too long to be kind of outside of the natural range, what we would call a normal 50mm-ish kind of focal length. And so 55mm, although it's not a big difference on full frame, of course, when you apply the crop factor to that, you're looking at 82.5 millimeters. And so as a byproduct, that's really close to the classic 85mm focal length, a little bit more maybe of a natural portrait focal length as well. So just something to consider there on that point. Now, a couple of things that do stand out about this that you should know, that as far as price, this is the medium priced option here. It's not an inexpensive lens. It's going to cost around $900 in the US market. And so, if you're kind of comparing it to the inexpensive 50mm f1.8 options, it's going to seem like quite an expensive lens, but at the same time, of course, its performance, its build, its focus, its image quality is definitely deserving to be in this class of lenses that I've compared it to, as opposed to kind of the budget 50mm options. And so it's not really a fair comparison. This lens is optically much better, and its build quality is superior. Yes, it's small and it's light, but this is a metal body constructed lens. It's a premium lens in everything save one missing feature, and that is that it has no kind of weather sealing. And so out of these options, if you want weather sealing, you're going to need to go to the even more expensive and much larger and heavier, although it's a fabulous lens, the Planar 50mm f1.4 from Sony/Zeiss. And so definitely an excellent lens in that way. Now, if you're wondering, does it have built-in OSS? No, it does not. And so if you happen to be shooting with a camera body that doesn't have OSS, you won't have image stabilization. With both the bodies that I tested it on, A6500 and A7R Mark III, they of course benefit from having steady shot, in-body image stabilization, and so it's kind of a moot point here. But just note that if you have a body without image stabilization or OSS, the optical steady shot is not in this lens itself. So just note that. One other thing to note is that this lens has the longest minimum focal length, 50 centimeters or 1.64 feet. And so as a byproduct of that, despite having a longer focal length, it actually has the lowest reproduction ratio or magnification value. In this case, the magnification is 0.14 times compared to the 0.15 times magnification of the Planar lens or the Samyang that I've been comparing it to. So not really a huge difference, obviously, just something that I wanted to note. This is the simplest optical formula at 7 elements in 5 groups. It has 9 rounded aperture blade, and it has a very small front filter thread of 49 millimeters. Although 49 millimeters is a fairly common one and is shared with a number of other diminutive lenses. So really there's very little to complain about when it comes to the actual build quality here. This is a focus by wire lens, and so as a result there's no kind of mechanical hard stop here you can turn all day long. And so manual focus is achieved when you enable manual focus, and in this case there's no external switches, so you're going to have to do that in camera and then you begin to focus. Now if you're in something like DMF mode, as soon as you go to do input here, the image will magnify on the screen or in the viewfinder and you can focus. The focus ring action is actually very good, and due to there being a very good and extremely quiet focus motor built into the lens, you're going to have a pretty good manual focus experience here. There doesn't seem to be much input lag, and so as a result, as I'm making focus changes, the weight feels about right. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, and there's enough damping there for precision. And so all in all, a good experience when it comes to that. And so if you do need to override focus, you might want to consider shooting in DMF, which enables autofocus, but also allows you to have kind of direct manual override in those situations that you want it. And it's got a focus ring that makes that a worthwhile endeavor. Now let's talk a little bit more about focus for a moment. In my comparison head-to-head with all of these, this is actually the quietest and probably fastest focusing lens of the bunch. Focus speed between the Sonnar lens here and the Planar lens that I've already referenced is pretty close, but the Sonnar is the quietest of the bunch. In fact, it is basically completely silent in operation. Even if I put my ear right next to the lens barrel, I hear nothing other than focus confirmation, which means, of course, that if you're shooting in silent shutter mode, say in an event type setting, the only noise that you will ever hear, or I should say no noise, really, the only indication that you will have of a photo being taken is the fact that you will see it writing to the card. It is a truly silent operation with this combination in silent mode, and so that's certainly a plus. And then of course it translates the best to video audio focus for that reason, and that focus is very, very good. It's very smooth. It does face tracking very well. I had no issues when using it for a video episode for that it did all the face tracking without any kind of nasty surprises, no pulsing or anything. But of course the fact that the focus is utterly silent makes this a very appealing video lens, and I know that a lot of people use it for that purpose. And so autofocus is very good. IAF works very well with the lens, and it will very quickly pick up on the eye, keep things in focus. And as I've mentioned in other type reviews, I mean, depth of field at close distances can be fairly shallow. And so if you really want to get great focus results, you may want to refine down the focus point that you use and the focus zone that you employ, because understand that what the camera decides should be in focus may not be what you want to be in focus. The guesswork is gone if you're using IAF or if you're using face detection with a human subject, and the camera is very smart about picking up that. But if you're shooting in a non-human object or subject, you may need to be a little bit more careful about what is actually in focus, as depth of field can be small, and a lot of times the way that a lot of us use Sony type autofocus systems, it's not so much like with the DSLR, those individual focus points. But in this case, you may need to refine that down, maybe a flexi spot. One thing that I like to do is to override, just putting a thumb on the screen, if I got up in the viewfinder, and then kind of selecting the area that I want. But just note that even doing it that way, that box is fairly large, and in some cases can be a little bit less precise than what you might want. And so there's no issues with focus accuracy with the lens. It's excellent. But there may be some issues in focus selection if you're not careful in refining your focus process, which is why, in some cases you may find that using something like DMF is a good option for the simple reason that you can then further refine that focus very quickly if you feel like the autofocus didn't grab the exact point that you want. Now, moving beyond this to image quality, I would encourage you first to look at this episode where I looked at image quality on APS-C. What I found in that episode is that image quality translates very well to APS-C. Basically everything about this lens translates well to APS-C. What I found is that center sharpness was good, and wide open contrast was good but not exceptional, and that there seems to be a slight bit of veiling due to having some uncorrected chromatic aberrations. And so as a result of that, there is a little bit less contrast at wide apertures than what you will gain when it's stopped down to about f2.8 or beyond. And so image actual resolution is very good, and in many ways this provided the most even resolution performance across the whole frame, either APS-C or full frame. But for example, the very expensive 50mm Planar lens, it is exquisite in the center of the frame, even at f1.4. And so it actually looks quite a bit sharper in the center of the frame, has greater contrast in the center of the frame. But I found that when moving out to the edges of the frame, that the difference between the two lenses was marginal. And actually stopped down to kind of landscape type apertures, f4 and smaller. This is actually the sharper lens at the edges of the frame. And so optical performance is actually really, really strong in terms of resolution. Because of those chromatic aberrations, contrast lags behind the planar, but when you stop the lens down, then the chromatic aberrations very quickly resolve themselves, and the byproduct of that is that you get more contrast. And so that's something to bear in mind. Now, when moving on to full frame, I found that a similar truth was there when looking at the 42 megapixel resolution of the A7R Mark III. And of course, as going from a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor to a 42 megapixel full frame sensor means that pixel density is roughly similar, and so it's not surprising that results aren't all that different. And so once again, same kind of thing, wide open, there's good resolution across the frame, contrast could be a hair better. Not to say that it's bad, but as those chromatic aberrations clear up, contrast begins to improve. And so that is all very good on that front. Beyond that, as I noted, there are some chromatic aberrations. They tend to manifest themselves. There's a little bit of purple fringing, but it's fairly mild. There's a little bit of green fringing after the fact. Neither is extreme, and so it's not really going to ruin any shots. It's more that the combination of that provides a little bit of veiling and reduces a little bit of contrast until they clear up. But in terms of chromatic aberrations being a huge factor that might ruin your shots, I don't expect that to be an issue. And so that part is good. Flare resistance is good, not exceptionally good, but good. There is some ghosting pattern when the sun's in the frame, but it's not strongly pronounced. And as long as you aren't crazy with backlighting, the lens does fairly well in that kind of situation. It's rarely a strength for a 50mm wide aperture prime lens anyway. This, I would say, is better than most. It's got Zeiss's T-star coatings, which are certainly very proven as being effective. Now, one area where I felt like the lens is not spectacular is in the quality of its bokeh rendering. And I find that it's the most prone of the three lenses towards kind of a cat eye effect along the edges of the frame. They're more pronounced in others. I also found that there is a little bit harder edges on some of the bokeh autofocus areas that tend to grab the eye a little bit more. And so out of the three lenses that I reviewed as a part of this series, I like the bokeh from this the least. I feel that it's the least smooth and it's the busiest of the three. It's not to say that it's bad, it's just in comparison to the others, it's my least favorite of the three. And so a few of these shots, maybe you can see what I'm talking about. I didn't find it objectionable, but I just found in reference to the other ones that this was my least favorite. And, you know, to kind of wrap things up, that really kind of highlights what I would say is kind of my chief knock against this lens. It actually does pretty much everything quite well. It's obviously the size is fabulous. The weight of it is fabulous. It has a very beautiful build. It has great autofocus. All of those things I consider to be great strengths for the lens. And optically, it's not like there's anything that's wrong with the optics. The optics are very good. But neither is there anything that is spectacularly right about the optics. And I just found that the images coming off of the off the camera in my comparison either on APS-C or on the A7R Mark III, I just didn't find them spectacular, particularly, you know, in the way that I most commonly use a lens like this for shooting, you know, wide aperture shots, and that the images look good, you know, there's contrast, there's sharpness, they look good, but they don't look exceptional. There's nothing that's particularly special about the rendering from this lens. And that is one other thing about this lens, is that it does trend up towards a little bit towards the cool spectrum. The Planar is basically a very neutral color rendition, which I like. The Samyang is a little bit warm, a little bit yellow. The Sonnar here is a little bit cool, a little bit blue to images. And so color accuracy, I think, just tends a little bit towards that end of the spectrum. I think that this lens is best suited to someone, number one, that doesn't want to spend the $400 or $500 more to move up to the Planar lens, and particularly someone who doesn't want to deal with the size and the weight of that lens compared to this. If you're shooting kind of a hybrid and if you're looking for a 50mm option for APS-C, I think this is your best option of the bunch because of it just fits there in terms of size and weight. And so I think for a lot of people that do video work, a lot of people that shoot on APS-C or on full frame or want a compact prime for travel, this is the best option for that. Just note that I think that there are 50mm options that produce more special images. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want to take a look in the description down below, you can go and look at my full written review, maybe evaluate some of the images for yourself, and there's also a link there to an image gallery that I've been contributing to along the way. And so, you know, what I consider to be special or don't consider to be special, maybe you do. And so by all means, the opinion that matters the most is yours. And so I encourage you to look at some images for yourself. And if you decide you want to buy, I will throw some affiliate links down in the description below. And thanks as always for those of you who purchase through those links to help to fund this channel. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day.